Hi, this is Evita Duffy here with the Federalist, and I am joined by Jason Hill, who is a professor of philosophy at DePaul University, where he specializes in ethics, politics, foreign policy, and moral psychology. He's the author of 5 books, including most recently, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People. His forthcoming book available on Amazon is What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. So welcome, Jason. Thank you
Oh,
for being here.
well, thank you for having me.
So you have been recently the target of a left-wing group of students who want you to be censored and silenced and maybe even fired for a recent tweet that you posted, and I'm going to read it off so everyone knows what it is. You said trans people should be treated with dignity. Agreed. Trans women ought not to be competing in sports with biological women. Why? Trans women are still biological men with all the physical privileges of male strength. This move is misogynistic and a declaration of war against women. So maybe you want to unpack that a little bit. What were you trying to say, and what was the response that you got from students and faculty?
Well, Joe Biden had made what I thought was a disastrous in his first uh, basically days in office. He had made
Mhm.
a disastrous strike against women's sports by my understanding, and I think I read it clearly, threatening to withhold federal funding from those institutions receiving federal funding that would disallow trans women who are biological men from competing on women's teams, women team sports for sporting events. And so I just thought that I would make this tweet registering as an American immigrant, an American citizen, my protest against what I thought was an egregious assault against women's sports. That is, there is a reason why we have separate women's and men's teams. We have women's tennis, we have men's tennis, we have women's soccer teams, and we have men's soccer teams. And the sports are segregated for a particular reason, which everyone knows that there are exceptions to the rule, but men are physically stronger by nature than women. And the idea that all trans women are going through some sort of hormonal treatment, which somehow weakens them, is misguided and actually empirically untenable. That is all one has to do if one is a trans woman is simply declare that one is transgender. It doesn't necessarily mean that one goes through some sort of hormonal treatment that renders one on the same physical status as a woman.
Mhm.
And so the idea that someone who has the strength of a linebacker that is 250 pounds and that could be competing with a biological woman who's
Yeah.
120 pounds strikes me as just pure malarkey, as insane. And I made this tweet. I, Subsequently, some woman in one of my classes then made an accusation that I was transphobic. I mean, it broke in the DePaul, the newspaper. I
Yeah.
woke up one
The
morning,
student newspaper. Yeah.
the student newspaper. I woke up one morning and found out that there was a story written against me, about me, claiming that I was transphobic, violently transphobic, on the premise that I had made some comment on one comment that I do not recall having made in the classroom, um, that we were going to be discussing whether a biological man could actually be a woman. I don't recall having made that comment. But I suspect what happened was that this person went trolling on my Twitter account, found the
Mhm.
tweet, and then retroactively made the comment based on being upset about the tweet. So that's my conjectural assumption of what happened.
Yeah. Well, and I think that what's so interesting about this, what's been happening to you, is that what you said is not that non-controversial. I mean, it is, but it shouldn't be, because I ran track in school, and it was I would have we would have all been clobbered if we had run against transgender women, which is basically men,
Mm-hmm.
and so I couldn't imagine, and I feel actually sorry for all of the women who work really hard to do well, and then have their dreams clobbered by having to compete with men and it not being fair. And so you made it. I liked the point that you made about this not being, pro women. This is not a feminist thing to advocate for. And actually, we've seen feminists come out and say, "Hey, this actually is like walking back a lot of the good things that we've done in the feminist movement." And so, why do you think there's this rift in the left between wanting to embrace transgenderism and at the same time silencing feminists who really care about women?
Well, I probably get in more trouble for saying this, but I don't really care because I think the truth has to be spoken. I think what is happening also, um, do you go by Ava or Evita?
Evita, yeah,
Evita.
Evita,
I think
yeah.
Evita, what's happening is that the LGBT movement,
Mhm.
which won its victory with the 2015 Marital Equality Act, which legalized gay and lesbian marriage before the law. After that, I think they should have just shut their mouths. But in order to keep their careers going, they have joined with the trans movement and the LGBT movement. I'm leaving out the Q and the T and the plus 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 plus. Um, they have they've acquired a lot of moral power over the decades, because what they were fighting for was something I think was quite legitimate, whether one agrees with it or not. That is, the government has no business interfering in the consenting lives of adults. Now, whether one wants to call it marriage or a sort of civic union is up for debate, which I think reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements about that. But the idea that there should be sodomy laws on the books and the idea that the government should be interfering in the private lives of consenting adults, I think was a legitimate fight on the rights of gay people
Mhm.
and lesbians. And they
Mhm.
won that battle. And they should have just quietly said, we won a victory. But they can't keep quiet. In order to keep their careers going, they have to now invoke something like trans rights or human rights, which I think is quite problematic because there is no such thing as a human right or a constitutional right
Mhm.
for a trans man, I'm sorry, a trans woman who again is a biological male to compete on a biological female team. That is not a human right. That is a fabricated right. It is not even a civil right. So I think to answer your question, we're seeing the transfer of a group of individuals who've acquired through decades of struggle some
Mhm.
kind of iconic moral power being by default transferred over to the trans movement, and I think that has a great deal of it's almost appropriated moral power that is unquestionably um, being accepted as just being legitimate. And as I said, trans people, like all individuals, should be treated with dignity and with
Mhm.
respect. There's a great deal of suffering going on in the mind of someone who thinks that they've been misgendered. But I don't think that compassion and dignity, which are emotions or gestures that all persons are deserving of, should be confused with an ideology that, when translated into laws and norms and mores and imposed on the rest of society, should be unquestionably accepted without challenge or without rejoinders.
Yeah, and I one of the things that struck me about the arguments being made against you was that you are wrong. That a trans woman is in fact a woman and not a biological male. What do you think is the cause of this inability to accept truth? Like we have these warped perceptions of what is true and what is fake, and it's unsettling, and it's kind of it's confusing to me, who's just being on the college campus and seeing this kind of rhetoric for the first time. How has this happened?
This is an interesting question, Evita, and it goes back to the basic assault on reason,
Mhm.
on logic, on objectivity. It goes back to the 1960s with the a rise of what I call the revolutionary victim studies, starting with Black studies, and then we had queer studies, and then women's studies and gender studies and Chicano studies and
Mhm.
post-colonial studies. And all these studies were activist studies that bred a kind of relativism in which feelings and identity politics and activism superseded and trumped authentic scholarship, which had as their mission goal education, the teaching of logic and reason. What happened in the 1960s was something quite nefarious and quite evil, I might say, where the idea of reason and logic itself themselves were seen as the creation of white imperialist male heterosexual racists. That reason itself, logic itself, were the constructs of racist imperialists to marginalize, to disenfranchise, to
Mhm.
oppress uh, minority groups. And so, what became the proper method of expressing oneself were feelings and one's the protection of one's identity at all costs. And then we had what came about in the 1980s was the rise of the self-esteem movement in K through 12, and then of course it sort of trickled down into, or matriculated, I should say, into colleges,
Mhm.
where feeling good about yourself through the expression of your feelings and your identities again superseded uh, achievement. One didn't have to achieve anything. All one had to do was emote and express one's feelings. And one just had to simply exist. And of course, one's existence is a good thing, but you don't earn your self esteem just by existing. You earn moral respect and you have invaluable moral worth and dignity by existing. But in terms of conferring esteem for an achievement, that is something that you have to achieve. So I think the merging of the radicalism of what was forged in the crucibles of the late 1960s with all these fake disciplines that had as their goals the complete abolition of reason and logic. And let me say this, the goal of those movements that were Marxist and oriented was the cancellation and the abolition of Western civilization. And the chickens have come home to roost. Those
Mhm.
movements were driven by a complete hatred of America, hatred of capitalism, hatred of achievement. They were what I call systemic nihilistic groups. And so we are seeing the result of that today in the form of cancel culture, in the form of um, not just cancel culture, but in the form of the abolition of complete Western civilization, everything that our civilization has stood for.
Yeah, and
This is the terminal point, the end point that we're seeing.
which is terrifying to think of, but everything that you just said is what I've been seeing. And I go to the University of Chicago, so we're close by. Um, and I guess I think this is a good way to shift into kind of what has happened to you and what's happened to me. I mean, I um, last year I had said that the coronavirus won't destroy America, but socialism will. And because I said that, it was posted on the university's social media, and
Mm,
I got lots of pushback. People went after my character, my intellect, my appearance, and I even got a death threat. And so it was just
I'm
insane
sorry to
pushback,
hear that.
cancel, right? But it's the same cancel culture that you've experienced, and actually this your tweet and what you allegedly said in the classroom is not the first time that you've experienced this. So the question is, what is, and you kind of answered it, but really, what is kind of the root of this cancel culture that you kind of talked about, and but then also what can we do as as people who are kind of on the outside of leftism on campus? We're not on the mainstream. What can we do to push back against it? And are we just victims of it? Are we just not able to do anything?
No, we can't be victims. We most certainly cannot be
Hmm.
victims. I think one of the biggest problems is that we have been condemned to silence and we have been condemned to be apologists for the greatness and the exceptionalism of Western civilization and of American exceptionalism. We've been made to feel ashamed of American exceptionalism, of the
Hmm.
superiority of Western civilization. There's a kind of cultural relativism. I've written about the stupidity, and I've been chastised by administrative leaders in my own university for claiming that not all cultures, for example, are equal. Some cultures are more superior than others. So we no, we're not victims, and we can't. We're victimized at times, but we can't adopt a victim identity. We must first of all stand up for the greatness of our unprecedented civilization, which is America,
Hmm.
and we must extol its virtues with complete intransigence and implacability, with no apology for the unprecedented um, rise in the standard of living that it has offered millions of immigrants and millions of Americans within its ambit. We must also proclaim the superiority of Western civilization and what is great about it, its production of the scientific method of science,
Hmm.
and we must proclaim this proudly and with argumentation and with fact and silence the shibboleths and the stupidity and the village idiots out there who are out with share with no facts but with just a lot of emotional vibrations and intimidation tactics, and show them that it's like standing up to the schoolyard bully. Once you show that you're not afraid and that you're absolutely proud of your convictions that are backed by facts, that's the first thing that we do. And then we marshal through our courage and through our fortitude and through our implacability and intransigence. There are
Hmm.
a lot of silent minorities. When I say minorities, I don't mean racial minorities, I mean conservative voices uh, who will rise up. All they're waiting for uh, is a sign from people such as myself and you and others who have that courage to rise up and offer a rejoinder. There are many people I've met who are closeted rebels
Hmm.
and defenders of our great republic and of our great civilization, but they're scared because they think they're alone.
Yeah.
The second thing that we do is I think we start to lead a movement to defund. I don't think it will happen under this administration, and I speak as a conservative independent, um, to defund our universities that or the social sciences, I should say, the humanities that function as national security threats in this country. I've written
Hmm.
several articles about that, and it's in my one of my books, We Have Overcome. That the professoriate in this country, they hate America, they hate capitalism, they hate. They're advocates of the welfare state. That our universities are becoming indoctrination centers
Hmm.
for far left. Um, they're indoctrination centers. They're no longer sites of learning, and they're national security threats because what they're doing is not just using the students as their pawns. They're not just it's there's no sin in teaching a multiplicity of ideas, left wing and right wing.
Hmm.
But when you criminalize reason, when you criminalize logic, and when you penalize your students for offering rejoinders, then there's something very nefarious and evil because the learning process has stopped and you're using your classroom as an indoctrination center. So we lead a movement to alumni, to big business, to stop funding the universities. Those universities like Rutgers, who've declared English as a racist language. This is crazy. Those universities that
Yeah.
are canceling, Homer and the classics,
Yeah.
that we become more vigilant and we become watchdogs.
Yeah. And I think that it's from a student's perspective, you don't do this in your classroom, but I've been in classrooms where the teacher has said, Men, be quiet. I only want women to talk right now." That's happened.
Yes.
I've been in classes, where I wanted to say, to stand up for Western civilization or the United States, and I'm somebody who's pretty outspoken, and I was afraid to do it. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a lot of silencing, gaslighting, and it's a hard place to be in, and a lot of the concrete things that you said work. And I think that people need to be tough, but you're right, there's a lot of closeted conservatives who are afraid to say anything at all, and I know them, and they will send me an email saying, "Oh, like I'm happy that you wrote this article, but I'm not, and I support you, but I'm not gonna you know say anything myself, right? And I see that all the time. Something that I think is interesting is I'm Hispanic and you're Black, and you talk about these these studies that have come, Chicano studies and Black studies, and what kind of effect does this have on the object of these studies? What kind of effect does this have on young Hispanic kids and young Black kids, Native Americans who have this victim narrative pushed on them constantly?
Well, it's that's an interesting question. What it does, it really reduces them to it instrumentalizes them in the first place, and it it they have had their agency really expropriated from them, where they are reduced to nothing but something like a monolithic culture. When we
Mhm.
know that cultures are not monolithic, that the idea that monolithic cultures exist is ridiculous, that their cultures are all diverse and there are diverse voices. But it is a sign of disrespect to members of these cultures, because as I'm Caribbean, I'm from a multi-ethnic background,
Mhm.
um, very multi-ethnic background, and we know that within cultures there are a diverse range of opinions, a diverse range of attitudes, of
Mhm.
political options. But to somehow univocally reduce culture to just one single metric or one single voice, and like cattle just herd all persons into that, is to objectify actually the
Yeah.
individual. So I think it has the effect of objectifying individuals, disregarding the larger sphere of their humanity. I mean, any individual is much larger than just a single interpretation of what their culture is. How dare people take themselves to be the spokesperson, whether that person is an outsider from the culture or a spokesperson for the culture, and say,
Mhm.
I'm a representative of Black culture, I'm a representative of Hispanic culture, and this is the voice of the Hispanic culture or Latino culture, or this is a voice of Black culture.
Mhm.
Who authorizes who to speak for whom? And how, so it has a deleterious effect, I think, on the agency
Mhm.
of members of minority cultures who might disagree, or who might just simply want to exist as individuals, who are individualists, who believe in individualism, who don't
Mhm.
want to be reduced to an ethnic category, but want to simply exist as an individual and be seen first and foremost as an individual who would rather be interpreted through the cultivation of virtues that he or she has cultivated through their characters, and not as some kind of ethnic ethnic object. So I think it's very disrespectful, and
Mhm.
it has a very deleterious and objectifying effect on such individuals.
Yeah. So I know this is sort of related, but I when you were talking, I started thinking about affirmative action, and affirmative action. It's not just a school thing. I mean, actually, you see it like parts of it, like the theory of it, implemented all over the place when it comes to scholarships, or to um, programs, or whatever. Um, and I've heard from people that I'm with, kids who will get, like an opportunity, and they'll say, "Oh, she only got in because she's Black. She only got in because she's Hispanic." And in a way, it seems like it devalues the accomplishments
Hmm.
of minorities, and or of Black and brown people. It's like, what? How does the left? I don't. How are they even able to um, compensate with that, like that they have this kind of double standard, like, oh, we're helping them, and at the same time it's almost like they're kind of devaluing them.
Well, this is to their advantage, because what they want to be is a I mean, they really are the original white supremacists. I mean, I say
Hmm.
this, those of them who are part of the managerial class,
Hmm.
that's exactly what they want to be, is a managerial lordship class that would like to have beneath them a set of subordinates
Hmm.
who are grateful and gratitude, who they imagine could never make it without their help. Um, and it's a sheer hypocrisy, because if you dare to exhibit exceptional traits in your character that would suggest that you actually don't need their help, that you can make it on your own merits and your own achievements, and that actually dare you have intelligent traits or
Mhm.
abilities that supersede or out, outdistances outdistance theirs, you incur their wrath. So I think it's just part of the hypocrisy of the radical left, and the not so radical left actually, in that they need to have, it's a sense of exercising power over other people.
Mhm.
And it's a form of egalitarianism where they want equity, which is to be distinguished from equality, where they want complete legislation of results, equal outcomes from unequal causes, which is what equity stands for, which is a very, very nefarious idea, because you cannot redistribute the virtues and the values that produce outcomes. So I think that one of the ways that we can sort of address this is by simply saying that, look, I think that we have affirmative action. One could, I think, again, reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements. There might have been a time in America's history, given the virulent racism on the Jim Crow, where it might have stood as a corrective. I can tell you, Evita, as a college professor, that if you are a Black man with a C average in America today, there is no progressive college. And let's face it, our colleges are as progressive as they come. That will not send a jet plane for you and
Mhm.
court. And if you have a C plus average, let's not even talk about a B average, and court and wine and dine you to get you into its universities, because you're considered,
Mhm.
if you're a Black male, an endangered species. I mean, that's how they
Right.
look at you, like an endangered species.
Right.
So the idea that colleges are racist towards minorities today, if you're a transgendered Black female, there's a suite of the Four Seasons waiting for you, right?
Yes.
So we have gone way beyond, I think, that pale of racism on today's college campuses, and we
Mhm.
have in our corporations, thanks to people like Ibram Kendi, where corporations are subjected to sensitivity racial training workshops, where if you say something really nasty or mean about a Black person, you're fired instantly. Your name is plastered all over social media. So I've lived in America for 35 years. I lived in the deep South when I first came here. I lived in Ku Klux Klan country, where every other building had a Confederate, every other house had a Confederate flag.
Mhm.
And I've seen how far we have come in terms of race relations. And I just think we are beyond a certain pale of racism, um, that, Blacks are very, very inoculated from speaking, at least in academia and in certain parts of corporate America, forms of racism where people are actually recruiting and looking for minorities, actively seeking minorities in positions of leadership, um,
Yeah.
to satisfy a kind of social appetite to see visible Black leaders and Blacks and other minorities in positions of power.
Yeah. And I think um, what was when we talk about how the left, they really, the reason why they reach out to these people is because they want to own them. They want to have this grateful group of people who will be ever indebted and ever a voting base, and when you don't vote for them, things don't go so well for that.
Yes. You continue. I'm glad that's the other part. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, I you better explain it than I am, but I've been called a coconut, like you're brown on the white side and you're brown on the white side, white on the inside, right? I mean, they are the worst at targeting people who uh, think for themselves and are still are still Black and brown.
Yes. You mentioned the more insidious part of it, um, I mean, one of the things when you're interviewed, you don't know the questions that are going to be asked. Your mind is going a mile a minute. But I forgot the more insidious part of it, which is that you're seen also as part of a voting bloc, a
Mhm.
demographic that we have to target that will vote for us if we give these sorts of favors and offer these benevolent gestures. We've got them. They'll vote for us.
Mhm.
Well, as an independent, nobody really has me or can own me, right?
Right.
So Yeah.
And they don't like that. they,
They don't.
they really don't like that. We can tell.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Professor Hill, I'm really grateful that you were able to join me today, and your insights were incredible, as I'm sure all of our listeners will think. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. It was my pleasure.